On October 1st, 331 BC, Alexander III of Macedon stood on the plains of Gaugamela near modern-day Mosul and watched the largest army ever assembled in ancient warfare prepare to annihilate him. Across the flat battlefield stretched the forces of Darius III, great king of Persia, ruler of an empire that controlled territory from Egypt to India, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Contemporary sources claim Darius commanded 1 million soldiers, though modern historians estimate a more realistic but still overwhelming 250,000 to 300,000 troops. They included the Persian Immortals, an elite 10,000-man guard that had never been defeated. They included 200 scythed chariots, terrifying weapons with razor-sharp blades extending from their wheels and poles, designed to slice through infantry formations like meat grinders through flesh. They included war elephants from India, cavalry from every corner of the empire, and enough infantry to outnumber Alexander's forces 6-1. Alexander had roughly 47,000 men, mostly Macedonian infantry and Greek allies, exhausted from 3 years of continuous campaigning through hostile territory. He was 25 years old, already considered the finest general of his age, but facing numerical odds that should have made victory impossible. Darius had chosen this battlefield carefully, spending months preparing perfectly flat terrain ideal for his cavalry and chariots, certain that this time he would crush the Macedonian upstart who had humiliated him at the Battle of Issus 2 years earlier. What happened in the next 8 hours would not just be a battle, it would be the complete annihilation of the Persian Empire, the conquest of the known world, and the transformation of a Macedonian king into Alexander the Great, a legend so powerful that his name would echo through history for 2,000 years. To understand the absolute impossibility of what Alexander achieved at Gaugamela, you must understand what the Persian Empire represented in 331 BC. This was not some declining power. This was the superpower that had ruled the Near East for over 2 centuries. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC, controlled the largest landmass any single government had ever ruled. At its peak, it stretched from the Indus River in modern Pakistan to Libya in North Africa, from the Black Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. It included Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and portions of Central Asia. The empire's population was estimated at 50 million people, roughly 44% of the entire world's population at that time. Its wealth was incomprehensible. The Persian kings collected tribute from dozens of satrapies, essentially provinces, each ruled by governors who sent gold, silver, crops, and soldiers to the imperial center. The royal treasury at Persepolis contained tens of thousands of talents of gold and silver, enough wealth to fund Alexander's entire army for decades. The Persian military system was sophisticated, drawing on the martial traditions of dozens of conquered peoples. The elite corps was the Immortals, so named because their unit was always maintained at exactly 10,000 men, with casualties immediately replaced to keep the number constant, making them seem immortal. These were professional soldiers equipped with the finest armor, trained from childhood, loyal directly to the great king. Beyond the Immortals, Persia could call upon massive cavalry forces from every region, each with different fighting styles and equipment, creating a diverse and flexible military. Darius III himself was not incompetent despite later propaganda portraying him as cowardly. He had come to power in 336 BC through a series of assassinations and political intrigues that demonstrated ruthless effectiveness. When Alexander invaded Persian territory in 334 BC, Darius initially sent subordinates to deal with what he viewed as a minor border incursion. But after Alexander won the Battle of Granicus and began conquering Persian territories in Anatolia, Darius recognized the threat and personally led an army to crush the invaders. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Darius commanded roughly 100,000 troops against Alexander's 40,000. The battle was fought in a confined space between mountains and sea that negated Persian numerical superiority. Alexander's tactical genius, particularly his use of the companion cavalry in a decisive wedge formation charge, broke the Persian lines and drove directly toward Darius's position. Ancient sources claim Darius fled the battlefield in panic, abandoning his army, his royal tent with his family, and even his mother and wife who were captured by Alexander. This version is probably exaggerated Greek propaganda, but Darius certainly withdrew from a losing battle, and his army collapsed after his departure. The defeat at Issus was humiliating, but not fatal. Darius retreated to the Persian heartland, gathered a new and vastly larger army, and chose a battlefield where Macedonian tactics couldn't work. He would not make the same mistakes again. The preparations Darius made for Gaugamela demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking. He spent months selecting and preparing the battlefield, choosing the plains near Gaugamela specifically because they were flat and open, perfect terrain for cavalry maneuvers and chariot charges. He ordered the ground leveled and smoothed, removing any obstacles that might impede his cavalry or chariots. He positioned his army to maximize numerical advantages, with massive cavalry forces on both flanks, ready to envelop the smaller Macedonian force. His center consisted of the best infantry, including the Immortals, while the 200 scythed chariots were positioned to charge directly at Alexander's phalanx, the core of Macedonian infantry. These chariots were terrifying weapons, essentially mobile killing machines with long blades extending from the wheel hubs, designed to rotate as the wheels turned, slicing through enemy legs, and additional blades on the chariot poles to impale or dismember anyone who got close. The psychological impact was enormous because soldiers could see these blade-covered vehicles thundering toward them and knew that standing firm meant being literally cut to pieces. Darius also deployed war elephants, massive beasts that terrified horses and could trample infantry. The Persian plan was straightforward: chariot charge to break the Macedonian phalanx, cavalry envelopment on both flanks to surround the enemy, then use the massive Persian infantry advantage to crush whatever remained. It should have been mathematically impossible for Alexander to win. Alexander's army, in contrast, was small, but supremely professional. His 47,000 troops included approximately 7,000 cavalry and 40,000 infantry. The core of his infantry was the Macedonian phalanx, roughly 12,000 men organized in units called taxis, each trained to fight in tight formation with 18-foot sarissas, pikes so long they gave Macedonian infantry reach advantage over any enemy. The phalanx worked by overlapping these massive spears, creating an impenetrable wall of pike points that enemy soldiers couldn't get close enough to strike. The men in the front ranks held their sarissas level. Those in rear ranks angled theirs upward over the front rank's shoulders, creating multiple layers of spear points. This formation was nearly invincible from the front, but had critical weaknesses. It was slow, couldn't maneuver quickly, and was vulnerable on the flanks and rear. Alexander's tactical genius was combining the phalanx with his companion cavalry, elite Macedonian horsemen numbering roughly 2,000 who fought in wedge formation. Unlike most ancient cavalry that charged in lines, the companions formed a triangle with Alexander personally at the point, allowing them to punch through enemy lines like a spear rather than spreading impact across a wide front. This wedge could penetrate deep into enemy formations, reach enemy commanders, and create chaos that the following infantry could exploit. Alexander's other cavalry units, the Thessalians and Greek allies, were also excellent, giving him cavalry forces that were individually superior to most Persian horsemen, even if vastly outnumbered. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals urged him to attack under cover of darkness to offset Persian numerical advantages. Alexander famously refused, declaring, "I will not steal victory," though the real calculation was probably that night attacks were chaotic and would negate Macedonian discipline advantages. Instead, Alexander spent the night conducting reconnaissance of the Persian positions and planning his battle strategy. His solution to the overwhelming Persian numbers was audacious. Rather than spreading his forces to match the Persian width and being enveloped, he would form his army with refused flanks, essentially angling the line back on both sides, and would attack at an angle, forcing the Persians to shift their formations and creating gaps he could exploit. He positioned his best troops, the companion cavalry and elite infantry units, on his right wing where he would personally lead the decisive attack. His left wing under General Parmenion would hold defensively, refusing engagement and simply surviving the Persian cavalry assault. The center would advance slowly, maintaining formation, drawing Persian attention. Then, Alexander would personally lead the companions in a charge aimed directly at the gap that would inevitably open in the Persian lines as they adjusted to the Macedonian attack angle. This required perfect timing, extraordinary courage to personally lead a charge into a force 6 times larger, and absolute trust that his men would follow him into what looked like suicide. It was the strategy of a genius or a madman, and Alexander had just enough of both to make it work. The battle began at dawn on October 1st, with Darius launching his scythed chariots directly at the Macedonian phalanx. 200 blade-covered vehicles thundered across the plain at full speed, driven by suicide drivers who knew they probably wouldn't survive, but were prepared to break enemy formations even at the cost of their own lives. The psychological impact on the Macedonian infantry must have been extraordinary, watching these spinning blades approach, knowing that if the formation broke, they would be sliced apart. But Alexander had prepared for this. The Macedonian phalanx didn't form a solid wall. It opened corridors, pre-planned gaps that the chariots could pass through. As the chariots reached the Macedonian lines, javelin throwers positioned in the gaps threw volleys of spears at the horses and drivers. Wounded horses veered off course, drivers were killed, and chariots lost control. Those chariots that made it through the gaps found themselves behind the Macedonian lines, where light infantry units surrounded and destroyed them, killing the horses and dragging the drivers from the vehicles. Within minutes, the entire chariot force was destroyed or scattered, having achieved almost nothing except demonstrating that innovation alone doesn't win battles without tactical integration. The failure of the chariot charge left Darius with no shock weapon to break the phalanx, forcing him to rely on conventional infantry and cavalry combat, where Macedonian discipline and training gave them advantages despite inferior numbers. The main cavalry battle erupted on both flanks simultaneously. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion commanded roughly 5,000 cavalry, facing at least 20,000 Persian and allied horsemen. His orders were simple: hold position, refuse engagement, survive. The Persian cavalry under Bessus, satrap of Bactria, charged repeatedly, trying to envelop the Macedonian left and attack the phalanx from the side or rear. The Thessalian cavalry under Parmenion's command fought brilliantly, using disciplined retreats and countercharges to prevent breakthrough, but they were being steadily pushed back and would eventually be overwhelmed. This was exactly what Alexander expected. As the Persian left wing committed more and more cavalry to overwhelming Parmenion, they thinned their center, creating the gap Alexander was waiting for. On the Macedonian right, Alexander personally led the companion cavalry in repeated probing attacks, forcing the Persian cavalry to engage, but not committing to a decisive charge yet. He was positioning his forces, finding the perfect angle, waiting for the moment when the Persian center would be vulnerable. Ancient sources describe Alexander as almost supernaturally calm during this phase, riding along his lines, adjusting positions, encouraging soldiers, completely ignoring the danger as Persian arrows fell around him. His presence inspired absolute loyalty. These men would follow him anywhere because he would lead them anywhere. He never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. He always fought at the front of every charge, taking the same risks as the youngest soldier. Then Alexander saw his moment. As the Persian cavalry on their left committed to overwhelming Parmenion, a gap opened between the Persian cavalry and their center infantry. It was perhaps only 500 yards wide, might close in minutes, but it was enough. Alexander wheeled the companion cavalry, roughly 2,000 riders in wedge formation, with himself at the point, and charged directly at this gap at full gallop. The companions were trained for this, had practiced the wedge charge thousands of times, knew that maintaining formation was everything. They smashed into the gap, penetrating deep into Persian lines, then wheeled left and drove directly toward Darius's position. The great king of Persia, watching from his command chariot surrounded by the Immortals and his personal guard, saw Alexander and 2,000 cavalry charging directly at him through the chaos of the battlefield. This was exactly what had happened at Issus, Alexander personally leading a charge at Darius's position. And at Issus, Darius's retreat had caused his entire army to collapse. Ancient sources claim Darius panicked and fled immediately. Modern historians suggest he made a tactical withdrawal to preserve command and prevent capture. The truth probably lies between. Darius withdrew from his position, and whether it was panic or strategy, the effect was the same. The Persian center saw their king departing the battlefield and morale shattered. The Immortals and royal guard fought ferociously to protect Darius's retreat, and many died buying time for their king to escape, but they couldn't hold against the Macedonian momentum. Alexander's charge had pierced the Persian center, but his victory was not yet secure because the battle was far from over. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion was in serious trouble, nearly surrounded by Persian cavalry, sending desperate messages to Alexander requesting help. A portion of the Persian cavalry had actually broken through the Macedonian left and was attacking the baggage train in the rear, creating chaos. Some of Alexander's generals urged him to abandon the pursuit of Darius and rescue Parmenion. Alexander faced a critical decision: continue pursuing Darius and risk his left wing collapsing, or wheel his cavalry back and leave Darius to escape again. He chose a middle path, sending a message to Parmenion to hold at all costs, then personally leading a portion of the companions back toward the Macedonian left, while ordering other units to continue pursuing Darius. The fighting as Alexander's cavalry fought their way back across the battlefield to relieve Parmenion was some of the most intense of the battle. Alexander himself was injured, taking a sword cut to the thigh, though he continued fighting. The companions crashed into the Persian cavalry, attacking Parmenion's position, hitting them from behind, and creating chaos that allowed the Thessalian cavalry to countercharge. The Persian cavalry, caught between Macedonian forces and learning that Darius had fled, began to break. Within an hour, the Persian left wing was in full retreat, and Alexander had saved his own left from collapse. The pursuit after the battle became a massacre that lasted for days. Once the Persian army began retreating, Macedonian discipline transformed into a slaughter. Alexander's cavalry pursued fleeing Persians for miles, cutting them down from behind, showing no mercy. Persian soldiers who threw down their weapons and tried to surrender were often killed anyway because taking prisoners would slow the pursuit. The casualty figures tell the story of complete catastrophe for Persia. Ancient sources claim 300,000 Persians died, which is certainly exaggerated, but modern estimates suggest 40,000 to 90,000 killed, possibly much higher when including the pursuit and those who died from exposure and starvation trying to reach safety. In contrast, Macedonian casualties were roughly 1,000 to 5,000 killed, an almost incomprehensible ratio that speaks to both the decisiveness of Alexander's tactics and the horror of ancient warfare, where defeated armies were systematically butchered in retreat. Among the Persian dead were thousands of the Immortals, the elite force that had never been defeated, now destroyed protecting their fleeing king. The royal treasury that Darius had brought to the battlefield, containing thousands of talents of gold and silver to pay his troops, was captured by Alexander. The great king's chariot, throne, and royal regalia were taken as trophies. Darius himself escaped, fleeing east toward the satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana, hoping to raise yet another army. He would never get the chance. The strategic consequences of Gaugamela were immediate and total. The Persian Empire didn't just lose a battle, it ceased to exist as a functioning government. Within weeks of Gaugamela, Alexander marched on Babylon, one of the ancient world's greatest cities, which surrendered without resistance. The satrap of Babylon, realizing that Darius was finished, opened the gates and welcomed Alexander as liberator. The treasury at Babylon contained 50,000 talents of gold, enough wealth to fund Alexander's army for years. From Babylon, Alexander moved to Susa, another Persian capital, which also surrendered immediately, yielding another 40,000 talents. Then he marched on Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, which he captured in early 330 BC. Persepolis contained the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of Persian imperialism, the tribute of dozens of nations, the royal treasuries of multiple great kings. Alexander seized 120,000 talents of gold and silver, the largest capture of wealth in ancient history, instantly making him the richest man in the world. Then, in an act that historians still debate, Alexander ordered Persepolis burned. Whether it was deliberate revenge for Persian invasions of Greece, an accident during drunken celebrations, or a calculated political statement that the Persian Empire was truly over, the burning of Persepolis symbolically ended 2 centuries of Achaemenid rule. But Alexander wasn't satisfied with conquering the Persian Empire. He wanted to conquer the entire known world. With the Persian heartland secured, he pursued Darius into the eastern satrapies, chasing the fleeing great king for months. Darius was eventually betrayed and murdered by his own satrap Bessus, who hoped to negotiate with Alexander from a position of strength by presenting himself as Darius's successor. Alexander was reportedly furious at Darius's murder, giving the last Achaemenid king a royal funeral and executing Bessus for regicide, though this was probably political theater to justify his own claim to the Persian throne as legitimate successor. With Darius dead, Alexander proclaimed himself Great King of Persia, adopted Persian royal dress and customs, and began integrating Persian nobles into his government and army. This caused tension with his Macedonian commanders, who had fought to destroy Persia, not to see Alexander become Persian. But Alexander understood that ruling an empire required legitimacy among the conquered peoples, not just military force. Over the next 7 years, from 330 to 323 BC, Alexander continued campaigning, conquering Bactria, Sogdiana, and invading India, pushing to the Indus River before his exhausted army finally refused to go further. By 323 BC, Alexander ruled from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia, the largest empire the world had ever seen, all achieved in just 13 years of continuous warfare. The human cost of Alexander's conquests is difficult to calculate, but was certainly immense. Modern estimates suggest that Alexander's campaigns killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians across 3 continents. The siege of Tyre in 332 BC resulted in 30,000 Tyrians killed or enslaved when the city fell after 7 months of resistance. The siege of Gaza cost 10,000 defenders' lives. At the siege of the Sogdian Rock in 327 BC, when a supposedly impregnable mountain fortress refused to surrender, Alexander's troops scaled the cliffs at night and slaughtered the garrison and their families. At the city of Massacre in India, after the city surrendered, Alexander's troops massacred the population anyway, killing thousands of civilians and mercenaries who had been promised safe passage. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of systematic terror tactics designed to convince other cities to surrender rather than resist. The massacres worked. Many cities opened their gates to Alexander rather than face destruction, but this doesn't make the bloodshed more justifiable. Alexander himself was wounded multiple times in combat, demonstrating personal bravery that inspired his men, but also resulting in severe injuries, including an arrow through the lung in India that nearly killed him. His soldiers were equally battered, campaigning continuously for over a decade, marching thousands of miles through deserts, mountains, and hostile territory, fighting dozens of battles, watching tens of thousands of comrades die. When Alexander's army finally mutinied at the Hyphasis River in India and refused to march further, they had every reason. They had conquered the known world and wanted to go home. Alexander never made it home. In June 323 BC, in Babylon while planning new campaigns to Arabia and beyond, Alexander fell ill with a fever and died within 10 days. He was 32 years old. The cause of death is debated. Malaria, typhoid fever, poisoning, and complications from previous war wounds are all suggested by different historians. The political chaos that followed his death destroyed everything he had built. Alexander had no clear successor, and his generals immediately began fighting over the empire in wars that would last for 40 years and kill hundreds of thousands more. The empire fragmented into multiple kingdoms ruled by Alexander's former generals, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria and Persia, the Antigonids in Macedon. None of these successor kingdoms achieved the unity Alexander had created, and all would eventually fall to Rome. Within 3 centuries of Alexander's death, every kingdom that emerged from his empire would be absorbed by new powers. His vision of a unified world empire died with him, revealing that military genius alone cannot create lasting political stability. That conquest is easier than governance. That building an empire requires different skills than destroying one. The mythology that developed around Alexander transformed him from a historical general into a semi-divine legend. Within decades of his death, stories circulated claiming he was the son of Zeus, that he had visited the oracle at Siwa who confirmed his divinity, that he performed miracles and conquered supernatural enemies. The Alexander Romance, a fictionalized biography, became one of the most popular books in the ancient and medieval world, translated into dozens of languages, spreading tales of Alexander fighting dragons, flying in a basket carried by eagles, and descending to the ocean floor in a glass chamber. These stories bore little resemblance to the historical Alexander, but served important cultural purposes, inspiring later conquerors from Julius Caesar to Napoleon, who saw themselves as Alexander's successors. The nickname the Great was attached to Alexander by Roman historians, not his contemporaries, reflecting how later ages viewed his achievements as unmatched. The historical reality was more complex. Alexander was indeed a military genius, perhaps the finest tactical commander in history, whose innovations in combined arms warfare influenced military theory for centuries. But he was also a brutal conqueror who destroyed entire civilizations, massacred populations who resisted, and died having created an empire that immediately collapsed because he had no succession plan and had built nothing that could survive without his personal leadership. The Battle of Gaugamela itself became legendary, studied in military academies for 2,000 years as an example of how tactical brilliance can overcome overwhelming numerical odds. Alexander's use of refused flanks, his patience in waiting for the perfect moment to charge, his personal leadership in the decisive attack, his ability to adjust his plan when Parmenion needed rescue, all demonstrated command genius that few generals in history have matched. But the battle also demonstrated the limitations of ancient warfare and the horrific human cost of glorious victories. 40,000 to 90,000 Persians died at Gaugamela, and in the pursuit, most of them common soldiers conscripted from across the empire who had no choice about fighting, who died for a king they had never seen, in a war they didn't understand, defending an empire that gave them nothing. The Macedonian dead, while far fewer, were equally tragic, young men who followed Alexander for years, survived dozens of battles, conquered impossible enemies, only to die in the mud of Mesopotamia, thousands of miles from home. The battlefield itself was so covered with corpses that ancient sources claim wild animals fed on the dead for years afterward. This was the foundation of Alexander's legend, a killing field so vast that scavengers couldn't consume all the bodies, where the glory of conquest was built on a carpet of rotting flesh. The Persian Empire that Gaugamela destroyed had its own legacy that deserves consideration. The Achaemenid Persians, for all their faults, had created a relatively tolerant multi-ethnic empire that allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religions, languages, and local governments as long as they paid tribute and didn't rebel. They had built the Royal Road, an advanced communication system that allowed messages to travel from Susa to Sardis in 7 days, a distance of 1,500 miles. They had created standardized coinage, uniform weights and measures, and postal systems that facilitated trade across their vast territories. They had commissioned great works of art and architecture, including Persepolis with its magnificent palaces and sculptures. When Alexander burned Persepolis, he destroyed not just a city but centuries of accumulated culture, art, and knowledge. The libraries, archives, and treasuries that burned contained information about ancient civilizations that is now lost forever. The craftsmen and artists who created Persepolis's wonders were killed or scattered. The administrative systems that had governed 50 million people collapsed. Alexander claimed to be liberating the Persian Empire's subjects from tyranny, but for many of those subjects, the conquest brought war, destruction, and economic collapse. The freedom Alexander offered was the freedom to be ruled by Macedonians instead of Persians, which was not necessarily an improvement. The final assessment of Gaugamela and Alexander's conquests must balance his undeniable military genius against the catastrophic human cost and ultimate futility of his achievements. Alexander conquered the known world in 13 years, a feat unmatched in ancient history, demonstrating tactical brilliance, strategic vision, and personal courage that justified his legendary status. The Battle of Gaugamela specifically was one of history's most impressive military victories, a 47,000-man army destroying a force 6 times its size through superior tactics, discipline, and leadership. But Alexander's empire died with him, fragmenting immediately, achieving nothing permanent except millions of deaths and the destruction of existing civilizations. The Persian Empire he destroyed had provided stability, however imperfect, to 50 million people for 2 centuries. The kingdoms that replaced it fought endless wars for 3 centuries, until Rome conquered them all. The glory of Gaugamela was paid for with 40,000 to 90,000 Persian deaths in a single day, plus hundreds of thousands more in the years of conquest that followed, creating a legacy of bloodshed that modern romanticization of Alexander conveniently forgets. On October 1st, 331 BC, 47,000 Macedonians destroyed the Persian Empire forever, not through justice or liberation, but through superior violence systematically applied until all resistance was crushed. Alexander became the Great by conquering the world, but the world he conquered would have been better off if he had stayed home in Macedon. That is the uncomfortable truth that the legend of Gaugamela obscures, but that the anonymous thousands buried in mass graves on the battlefield understood all too well.